Hi, this is a video that chronicles my adventures of diagnosing some driveline vibration in my 95 Jaguar XJR. I was experiencing minor vibration above 60 miles an hour, or right at 60 up to 70 or so. It turned out that it wasn't an alignment issue, but this is the diagnostic process and the repair that I effected. Replacing, in the end, the center bearing solved the problem. So I have a very mild vibration, around 50 miles an hour that kicks in. And reading online, one of the Jag things to do is to take this center bearing for the drive shaft and operate a little bit left of center. Looking at this, I would say it's considerably, from the rear of the car where I'm at, it's considerably right of center. So I'm thinking somebody in the past previous center may have misaligned it, so I'm going to try and move it to the left to see if I can get rid of my little bit of vibration. Okay, so this is my attempt to line up the drive shaft, prop shaft on this car. The idea is to get a lineup that looks pretty much like this, where the two strings, which are both ends of the drive shaft at the back of the two-piece drive shaft, and the front of the drive shaft are about, that socket up the front's about 38 millimeters. So lined up, it should be to the right of that socket. Did some work with re-indexing to minimize the vibrations, but until I remove this bracket that holds up the centerline bearing, I completely missed this issue. You can see the rubber that holds the bearing in place has perished somewhat, and long story short, I need to replace it. Probably, I've ordered new UJs as well. So there's two on this drive shaft. There's one right here and one here. So what I'm going to do is probably see if I can get this drive shaft out without dropping the exhaust system down. There was just enough clearance to get the drive shaft out. This support bracket here for the handbrake and for the center bearing needs to be removed, and sadly you have to separate or at least I had to separate the drive shaft before I could get both sides out. The center bearing is totally toast. It's pretty amazing, actually. It's probably jumping around quite a bit in there. So this is my solution to getting the drive shaft back in. As you can see, I have the Harbor Freight transmission jack, have the front end of the drive shaft held at an angle as high up as it will go with a bungee cord, and adjusted the Harbor Freight jack to be able to kind of hit the angle. why am I doing this? Well, anyone who's tried this is it's extremely difficult to coordinate by hand, holding up the drive or holding on the drive shaft with one end and maneuvering this rear part of the drive shaft on the other side. So would recommend this if you're not going to drop the exhaust. I mean, obviously if the exhaust dropped down a bit, you could assemble all of this out of the car, but in order to do it this way, you have to separate things. The other thing I've noticed with this one and also my spare drive shaft, that getting things going here, as you can see, I've got all my paint marks there. Getting things going can be a little bit difficult even when you've got those splines lined up. So a little bit of grease, as this is actually a slip yoke, and in my case I needed a little bit of gentle persuasion, but you know, your mileage may vary. I was really sure I had the splines lined up, but trying to do all that barehanded probably is going to be pretty tricky. It's fairly simple once you've connected the drive shaft at the angle that I had shown you to push it back up through the tunnel. There is enough room to maneuver it and get it lined up with the output shaft of the transmission. Don't forget to put your center bearing support bracket back in. Ask me how I know. There is enough room to slide that in and out with the drive shaft in. Or I should say prop shaft, because it is a Jaguar. That's about it, really. I mean, it's not that hard. I mean, obviously, in my case, I'm not ready to drop the exhaust. It's just kind of, there's going to be welding and possibly cutting involved. I'm a little bit concerned about my downpipe bolts. They're probably going to shear off, but when I do get around to doing it. But for now, I'm wanting to see if the drive shaft will, with a replacement center bearing, will be smoother and quieter. And if it is, I'm not going to bother to replace the UJs because they're in really good shape. They rotate real easily and there's no movement in them. So now it's just a case of buttoning everything up. I mean, I'm going to maintain the indexing I found that was the least vibration. There is a spacer plate under the center bearing here that need to remember to put back in terms of up and down movement. Brief note here, there's not a lot of room in here to get the front end of the prop shaft bolts in. You actually can't remove these from the back without taking out the yoke. But I found that my system was to use a open-ended wrench on this end, and this guy is just enough clearance here to get a thin-walled 9/16 socket on. Okay, so I have the drive shaft, prop shaft nuts and bolts here tightened up to what I can get them to with a 1/4-inch drive socket. I'll tighten them fully later. Now turning my attention to the center bearing support plate here. Use a bit of wood to encourage the drive shaft to stay out of the way as I install it. The note I wanted to make was that when I took this apart, there are, I'm assuming this is from factory, some shims here. There are washers between these bolts and the frame on both sides, but on the very far end here, it was shimmed somewhat. Don't know if that has to do with balancing. You know, I wonder if Jaguar actually balanced these drive shafts kind of in situ, so to speak. But anyway, just a note here to be careful when you do drop this bracket out that there are spacing shims underneath it, and pay attention to what they look like and replace them in the same place. Also, between the support bearing and the bracket itself is a thin piece of aluminum, also a spacer, which I imagine helps with the vertical alignment. A couple of notes. When fully tightening down these front prop shaft nuts, I mean, they're a little difficult to get at. I found that these super cool snap-on wrenches are the perfect tool for that. And then to hold the prop shaft, I was just using a wrench on the back of it. You could stick a screwdriver up for the U-joint, I guess, but that's what I did. And the other thing I noticed was with the center bearing adjustment, sounds like it's best to leave it till last. So tightening up this bracket and the center bearing, wait until you've torqued down this side. Okay, all done. Everything buttoned up. Thing to do now is to road test it at 60 mph plus to see if the vibration and etc. is still there. GoPro, stop recording.